Father abandons daughter. 10 years later, she's paralyzed to see him sitting in the church pew on Christmas recital night. When she tries to approach, the last rays of December sunshine filtered through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church of Pine Grove, Maine, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the worn keys of the Steinway grand piano. Sarah Mitchell's fingers hesitated over the opening notes of O Holy Night, her mother's favorite Christmas hymn. At 25, she carried both the grace of her mother's spirit and the weight of her father's absence in every note she played. The empty church held its breath as Sarah began to play, each note echoing through the rafters where garlands of fresh pine waited to be hung for the annual Christmas recital. 10 years of Christmas recitals, and still, that empty spot in the front pew where her father used to sit made her heart ache. The old church bell tolled unexpectedly, breaking her concentration. Sarah's hands jerked away from the keys, scattering sheet music across the floor. Her heart pounded. That bell hadn't rung since the Christmas Eve her father left. As she knelt to gather the scattered papers, her hand brushed against something tucked beneath the piano bench. A forgotten photograph. Sarah's fingers trembled as she held it up to the fading light. Christmas 2013. Her father stood tall beside the church's Douglas fir, his arm around her mother Elizabeth as they helped Sarah hang the Mitchell family ornament. A delicate glass bell passed down through 3 generations. The scent of her mother's signature gingerbread and cinnamon rolls seemed to drift from the memory itself, mixing with the fresh pine boughs that now lay waiting to be decorated. "Lord, give me strength," Sarah whispered, her mother's favorite phrase falling from her lips. This would be her first Christmas without either parent, her father by choice, her mother by God's will. Elizabeth had passed away in June, taking with her the last bridge between Sarah and her father's memory. The sound of car doors shutting outside pulled Sarah from her reverie. The ladies of the church's Christmas committee would be arriving soon with boxes of vintage ornaments, each bauble carrying its own story of Pine Grove Christmases past. She tucked the photograph into her music folder, straightened her shoulders, and moved to unlock the heavy wooden doors. Mrs. Henderson bustled in first, arms laden with carefully wrapped decorations from the 1950s. "Sarah, honey, we were just talking about your mother's Christmas cookie recipe. Remember how she'd always save the first batch for the choir?" Sarah managed to smile, helping the older woman with her precious cargo. More church members filed in, their chatter filling the sanctuary with warmth. These women had watched Sarah grow up, had supported her mother through 10 years of single parenthood, and now surrounded Sarah with the same steadfast love. "The children are so excited about next week's recital," Mrs. Henderson continued, unwrapping ornaments with practiced care. "Little Amy can't stop talking about playing Silent Night, just like you did at her age." Sarah nodded, grateful for the distraction of organizing sheet music. Her students' upcoming Christmas recital would mark a decade of this tradition, one she'd started the year after her father left, channeling her pain into purpose by teaching piano to children who couldn't afford lessons. As she helped arrange the vintage decorations, each piece sparked a memory. The ceramic angel her mother carefully wrapped each January, the silver star that topped the tree every year, the collection of bells that seemed to mock the silence of the church's great bell tower. 10 years of Christmas memories, each one marked by that silence. The unexpected toll of the bell earlier nagged at her thoughts. The mechanism had been broken for years. Her father had been the last one to ring it, on that final Christmas Eve before he disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty house and a note saying he was sorry. Sarah's fingers found the edges of the hidden photograph in her folder. The Christmas committee ladies continued their work, sharing stories of holidays past, their voices mixing with the ghostly echoes of carols long since sung. In 1 week, these pews would be filled with proud parents watching their children perform. And as always, Sarah would scan the crowd, her heart foolishly hoping to see her father's face among them. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, and Sarah returned to the piano, its keys catching the last glints of daylight. This year's recital program lay before her, topped by O Holy Night, her mother's final request. As she began to play again, the familiar melody carried with it a decade of unspoken prayers and unanswered questions. Outside, snow began to fall, each flake a tear from heaven, blanketing Pine Grove in winter's quiet mercy. Sarah stood in her childhood home's attic, dust motes dancing in the beam of winter sunlight streaming through the dormer window. The realtor's "for sale" sign had gone up yesterday, each letter a finality she wasn't quite ready to face. Her mother's passing 6 months ago had left the Victorian house feeling like a museum of memories, ones she needed to sort through before closing this chapter of her life. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to a corner stacked with Christmas decorations. Each box bore her mother's neat handwriting: tree ornaments, 1950s, holiday linens, Christmas memories. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid of a worn cedar chest she'd never seen before. The scent of preserved cedar and mothballs wafted up, along with something else: her mother's signature lavender sachet. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, lay holiday treasures from a seemingly distant era. Sarah lifted out a hand-blown glass ornament, its surface catching the light just as it had on their family tree decades ago. A small note fell from its wrapping. "Thomas's first Christmas gift to me, 1995. Her father's name written in her mother's hand made Sarah's heart catch. Beneath the ornament lay more artifacts of a happy family she barely remembered. Hand-knit stockings, a slightly tarnished angel tree topper, and strings of vintage bubble lights that had once transformed their tree into a magical display. At the bottom of the chest, Sarah discovered something unexpected: a silver box tied with faded red ribbon. Inside, dozens of Christmas cards filled the space, each sealed and addressed to Thomas Mitchell, at various general delivery addresses across the country. Her mother's unsent messages to a man who'd chosen to disappear. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the first card, dated the Christmas after he left. "Dearest Thomas, Sarah played O Holy Night at the church recital today. She has your gift for music, though she may never know it. The church bell remains silent. No one has touched it since you left. I keep hoping that one Christmas we'll hear it ring again." Card after card chronicled their lives without him. Each Christmas, Elizabeth had written faithfully, never sending the messages but refusing to let go of hope. The last card, dated just months before her passing, made Sarah's vision blur with tears. "My dear Thomas, this may be my final Christmas card to you. The doctors say I don't have long, but I want you to know I forgave you long ago. Our Sarah has grown into an amazing young woman. She teaches piano now, sharing the gift of music you gave her. If you're out there reading this, know that it's never too late to come home." A sharp knock downstairs startled Sarah from her reading. The mail carrier's footsteps retreated from the front porch, and something fluttered through the mail slot. Sarah made her way downstairs, still clutching her mother's last card. Among the usual bills and advertisements lay a plain white envelope addressed to Miss Sarah Mitchell in unfamiliar handwriting. The postmark was from a town in Arizona she'd never heard of. Her heart seemed to stop as she read the return address: Thomas Mitchell. Sarah sank onto the bottom stair, the letter heavy in her hands. Through the front window, she could see the church steeple rising above the snow-covered trees, its silent bell a testament to years of unanswered questions. The envelope held the weight of a decade's silence, of her mother's forgiveness, of possibilities she'd long since abandoned. From the attic above came the faint sound of ornaments clinking together in the cedar chest, stirred by the winter draft. Each tiny bell seemed to whisper the same question. Was she ready to read what her father had to say? Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope as snowflakes began to fall outside, each one carrying the weight of a memory, a regret, a possibility. The Christmas cards from her mother lay scattered on the attic floor above, their messages of forgiveness echoing in the empty house. Sarah took a deep breath, channeling her mother's strength, and carefully broke the seal of her father's letter. The church kitchen filled with the sweet aroma of her mother's Christmas bread as Sarah measured ingredients with practiced precision. Her mother's recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages stained and dog-eared, bearing witness to years of holiday baking. In the margins, Elizabeth's familiar handwriting offered secrets passed down through generations. Add an extra pinch of cinnamon. Let rise near the window, sunlight makes it perfect. Through the kitchen window, snow continued to fall on Pine Grove, transforming the church grounds into a winter wonderland. Sarah's hands worked the dough methodically, trying to focus on the familiar motions rather than the letter burning a hole in her apron pocket. Her father's words echoed in her mind, impossible to ignore. "Dearest Sarah, I'm writing to tell you that I'm receiving treatment for early-stage lymphoma. The doctors are optimistic, but facing mortality has a way of forcing one to confront past mistakes." The kitchen door creaked open, and Mrs. Henderson bustled in with an armload of mail. "More Christmas cards for the church, dear, and oh, something personal for you." She handed Sarah another envelope bearing the same Arizona postmark. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, flour dusting the air. Her father's second letter felt heavier than the first. As she broke the seal, a photograph slipped out, her last Christmas recital, taken from the back of the church. Her breath caught in her throat as she read, "I've attended every recital, Sarah. Always in the last pew, always leaving before you could see me. Your mother knew. She would leave a program on that back bench every year, my name written in her beautiful handwriting. I was too ashamed to come forward to face what I'd done." The bread dough sat forgotten as Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her mother's recipe book still open to the Christmas bread page. There, in the margin, she noticed something she'd overlooked. "Save one loaf for Thomas's bench. Maybe this year he'll stay." The kitchen door opened again, this time bringing Mrs. Peterson with a box of vintage Christmas cookie cutters. She paused, noting Sarah's expression. "Your mother used those same cookie cutters every Christmas, said they carried memories of sweeter times." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. How many people had known her father was there, watching from the shadows? How many had kept his secret out of respect for her mother's wishes? Her fingers traced her mother's handwritten notes in the recipe book. "Christmas bread brings healing," Elizabeth had written. "Just like music, it speaks to the heart." Another letter arrived with the afternoon mail. Sarah's hands trembled as she read about the years her father spent driving his truck route, deliberately passing through Pine Grove during the holidays. He wrote about anonymous donations to the church's music program, about watching her grow from afar, about the weight of shame that kept him in the shadows. The bread dough had risen perfectly in the winter sunlight, just as her mother's notes promised it would. Sarah shaped it carefully, adding the extra pinch of cinnamon, following the legacy of love spelled out in flour and ink. The rhythm of baking had always helped her think, had always been her way of connecting with her mother's memory. But now, each step of the recipe seemed to reveal another layer of her mother's quiet hope, her patient waiting, her endless capacity for forgiveness. The margin notes took on new meaning. "Love rises in its own time. Patience makes perfect. The warmth always returns." As the bread baked, filling the church kitchen with memories, Sarah faced a decision. The Christmas recital was approaching. Would she finally acknowledge the presence in the last pew? Or would the weight of 10 years' absence prove too heavy to lift? The timer chimed, and Sarah pulled golden brown loaves from the oven. Their aroma filled the kitchen, exactly as she remembered from childhood Christmases. One loaf would go to the church fellowship, another to her piano students' families. And the third? Sarah wrapped the last loaf carefully, just as her mother had done year after year. She placed it on the back pew of the church, where a father's shame met a mother's hope, where music and memory danced in the shadows, where healing waited to rise like bread in the winter sunlight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a possibility, each moment a choice between holding on and letting go. The afternoon light filtered through the church's stained glass windows as Sarah guided her young students through their Christmas recital rehearsal. 8-year-old Amy sat at the Steinway, her small fingers working through Silent Night, while other children carefully unpacked pieces of the church's historic nativity scene. "Miss Sarah," Amy called out, pausing mid-measure, "why do you always look so sad when we practice the Christmas songs?" The question hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the colored light. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter, Emily, spoke up from where she was unwrapping the porcelain shepherd. My grandma says Miss Sarah's daddy used to play the piano here too. She says he was the best musician in Pine Grove. Sarah's hands steadied themselves on the piano's polished surface. Yes, he was, she managed, surprising herself with the admission. He taught me to play O Holy Night on this very piano. The children gathered closer, sensing a story. Katie, holding the baby Jesus figurine, settled at Sarah's feet. What happened to him, Miss Sarah? Sarah paused, searching for words appropriate for young ears. He had to leave a long time ago. Like my daddy? Tommy asked quietly from behind the piano. Mom says he's finding himself, but I think that means he's lost. The honest simplicity of his words caught Sarah off guard. She knelt beside the boy, noting how carefully he held the wise men figurines. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Tommy. Big ones. Mrs. Peterson, arranging poinsettias near the altar, spoke up gently. You know, children, this nativity set has been part of our church since 1950. Every piece tells a story of journey and return. The elderly woman lifted the Joseph figure with reverent hands. See these tiny cracks? In 1962, this piece was broken. Someone knocked over the display, and poor Joseph shattered. But old Mr. Crawford, our resident craftsman, spent weeks restoring it. Sometimes broken things can be made whole again. Sarah watched as her students absorbed this wisdom, their small hands touching the mended figure with new understanding. The parallel wasn't lost on her, or on Mrs. Peterson, who met her eyes with knowing kindness. Miss Sarah, Amy ventured, returning to the piano, could you play O Holy Night for us? The way your daddy taught you? The request sent Sarah's heart racing, but something in the children's expectant faces steadied her. As her fingers found the familiar keys, Mrs. Fura Henderson appeared in the doorway, clutching what looked like old newspaper clippings. The music filled the sanctuary as Sarah played, muscle memory carrying her through the complicated runs her father had patiently taught her. Through the melody, she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to Mrs. Peterson, not quite quietly enough, found these in Elizabeth's old files, every recital write-up from the past 10 years. Look, there he is, in the background of every photo. Always watching from that back pew. Sarah's fingers faltered on the keys. The children, arranging the nativity scene, seemed not to notice, but her heart thundered in her chest. A decade of newspaper clippings, documenting not just her students' performances, but her father's faithful vigil. Keep playing, dear, Mrs. Peterson encouraged softly. Music has a way of building bridges we didn't know we needed. As Sarah continued, each note seemed to carry the weight of revelations. The children worked together, completing the nativity scene piece by piece, their small hands healing old breaks, brushing away years of dust, making space for new stories among the old. Tommy placed the last shepherd in position, then came to stand by the piano. Miss Sarah? Sometimes when I'm really sad about my daddy, I pretend he's listening to me practice. Do you ever do that? Sarah's hands stilled on the keys. I don't have to pretend, Tommy. He's been listening all along. I just didn't know it. The afternoon light caught the tears in Mrs. Henderson's eyes as she carefully laid the stack of newspaper clippings on the piano. Your mother kept every single one, she said softly. She always said the best Christmas gifts are the ones we don't know we're receiving. Outside, the church bell tower stood silent against the December sky. But within the sanctuary, music and memory wove together, creating something new from something broken. The nativity scene, fully assembled now, seemed to glow in the fading light, each piece telling its own story of journey, loss, and return. Sarah gathered her students for one final rehearsal, the weight of the newspaper clippings pressing against her heart. In 1 week, the sanctuary would be full of proud parents, twinkling lights, and Christmas joy. And somewhere, in the last pew, a father would be listening, but for how long? The massive Douglas fir stood waiting in First Baptist Sanctuary, its branches reaching toward the vaulted ceiling like open arms. Every December since 1950, the tree had served as Pine Grove's living chronicle of faith, hope, and redemption. Each ornament telling a story of God's grace in their small Maine community. Sarah stood at the base of the ladder, holding a weathered cardboard box labeled Angels of Hope. Mrs. Henderson carefully descended, carrying an ornament that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. This one, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. belonged to the Williams family. Their son was lost at sea in '52. Every Christmas Eve, they hung it front and center, believing he'd come home. In '55, he walked through those doors, having survived all those years on a small Pacific island. The ornament, a simple glass angel with a tiny brass bell, tinkled softly as Mrs. Henderson placed it in Sarah's hands. "Your mother polished this one every year, dear. She said it reminded her that hope never truly dies." As the ladies of the church's Christmas committee continued unpacking ornaments, each bauble revealed another thread in Pinegrove's tapestry of faith, the old brass star that topped the tree during the Depression years. The hand-painted globes from the Victory Christmas of 1945, the delicate glass icicles that survived the church fire of '63. "Where's the Mitchell bell?" young Amy asked, sorting through a box of vintage ornaments. "Grandma says it's the prettiest one." Sarah's heart clenched. The family heirloom, passed down through 3 generations, had always held pride of place on the church tree. But after her father left, they'd stored it away, too painful a reminder of happier times. "I think it's time," Mrs. Peterson said gently, pressing a small key into Sarah's hand. "The storage room, top shelf, blue box." Sarah's fingers trembled as she unlocked the door. There, exactly where Mrs. Peterson had indicated, sat a dusty blue box tied with faded gold ribbon. But as she lifted it down, something fluttered to the floor, a collection of small notes, yellowed with age. Each one, she realized with a start, was in her father's handwriting. Dated Christmas Eves, one for every year he'd been gone. Messages of love, regret, and hope, tucked away with the family bell he'd never stopped thinking about. December 24th, 2015, watched Sarah teach Amy's older sister today. "She has Elizabeth's patience, my love for music. The bell remains silent, but her music speaks volumes." December 24th, 2018, Sarah played "O Holy Night" today. Same key as Elizabeth always chose. Some traditions survive even when families don't. December 24th, 2023, Elizabeth's gone now, but her grace lives on in our daughter. Perhaps it's time the bell rang again. Sarah carried the box and notes back to the sanctuary, where the ladies waited expectantly. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, the Mitchell bell gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. "Your mother never gave up hope," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "Every year she'd slip up here alone and clean it just in case." As Sarah lifted the bell from its wrapping, she noticed something new. A tiny engraving on the base, dated just months before her mother's passing. "Love endures, faith sustains, hope never dies." The discovery of her father's notes had spread quietly among the ladies. Some wiped tears, others whispered prayers, all understanding the weight of this moment. 10 years of secret vigils, anonymous donations, and silent presence in that back pew, all documented in fading ink and quiet hope. "Where should we hang it?" Amy asked, breaking the reverent silence. Sarah looked at the soaring tree, at the generations of faith represented in its branches. Then she looked at the back pew, where a father's love had watched and waited for a decade. "Right in front," she decided, her voice steady. "Where everyone can see it. Where hope belongs." As she hung the Mitchell bell in its new place of honor, its gentle chime seemed to echo the church's great silent bell tower. The sound carried with it her mother's endless faith, her father's constant love, and perhaps the promise of healing yet to come. Outside, the December twilight settled over Pine Grove like a benediction, while inside, the great tree stood witness to another chapter in its long history of miracles and grace. The day before the final rehearsal dawned crisp and clear, Pine Grove's streets glistening with fresh snow. Inside First Baptist, Sarah sat at the Steinway, listening to the quiet chaos of preparation. Women bustled about with evergreen garlands, while her students arranged their music stands with solemn care. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow's rehearsal. "Miss Sarah?" Amy tugged at her sleeve, concern written across her small face. "Are you sure you want me to play first? What if I make a mistake?" Sarah smiled, remembering her own first Christmas recital. "Want to know a secret? My father taught me that mistakes are just grace notes in disguise. Here, let me show you." The church door creaked open, interrupting her demonstration. Mrs. Henderson hurried down the aisle, clutching a familiar envelope. "Special delivery, dear, express mail." Sarah's hands stilled on the keys. Another letter from Arizona. The past week's revelations still churned in her mind. The newspaper clippings, the hidden notes, the Mitchell bell now gleaming front and center on the great tree. What more could there be to say? "Children," Mrs. Peterson called out, reading the situation perfectly. "Let's take our hot chocolate break early today. I made extra marshmallows." As the students filed out excitedly, Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Several pages fell into her lap, along with a small medical document. "Dearest Sarah, the doctors say the treatments are working, but time feels more precious than ever. There's something you need to know about the day I left." Sarah read on, her heart pounding. The investment scheme that had ruined them hadn't been mere bad luck. It had been orchestrated by her father's closest friend, targeting not just their family, but half the businesses in Pine Grove. The shame of being duped, of potentially destroying not just his family, but his community's trust, had broken something in him. "I couldn't face the town knowing I'd helped convince others to invest. Your mother understood, she always did. But I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes. So I ran, like the coward I was. Every dollar I've earned since then has gone to slowly, secretly repaying those debts. The last payment was made this morning. Included was a bank statement showing anonymous deposits to various Pine Grove accounts over the years, totaling more than the original losses. Her father had spent 10 years making amends from the shadows. The church door opened again. This time it was Reverend Marshall, looking grave. "Sarah, I've just had a call from the hospital in Arizona, your father." Sarah's heart stopped. "He's been discharged. The treatments were successful." The Reverend smiled. "He asked me to tell you he's coming home, whether or not you want to see him." The sanctuary seemed to spin. From the kitchen came the sound of children laughing, the clinking of cocoa mugs, the simple joy of Christmas preparation. But here, in the quiet space beside the piano, Sarah faced the biggest decision of her life. Her father's letter contained one final page. "I understand if you can't forgive me, but there's something you should know about the church bell. That last Christmas Eve, before I left, I climbed the tower one final time. The mechanism wasn't really broken. I just couldn't bear the thought of it ringing without me there to share it with you. The repair manual is still in the old toolbox. Maybe it's time for Pine Grove to hear its voice again. All my love, Dad." Sarah looked up at the silent bell tower, that visible through the high windows. 10 years of silence, of secrets, of shame and redemption. Tomorrow was the final rehearsal. The day after, the recital. And somewhere between those moments, a train from Arizona would arrive carrying a father who had spent a decade paying debts, watching from shadows, and hoping for grace. Outside, the winter sun caught the Mitchell bell on the great tree, sending prisms of light dancing across the sanctuary. Each rainbow seemed to whisper the words engraved on its base. "Love endures, faith sustains, hope never dies." From the kitchen, she could hear Amy practicing Silent Night on the small keyboard they kept for rehearsals. The simple melody carried with it all the promise of Christmas, of peace, of redemption, of homecoming. Sarah touched the piano key softly, finding the opening notes of "O Holy Night." Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But today, in this moment, hope rang clearer than any bell ever could. The evening of the recital arrived wrapped in softly falling snow, transforming Pine Grove into a scene from a Christmas card. First Baptist stained glass windows glowed warmly, beckoning families in from the cold. Inside, the sanctuary hummed with anticipation as parents and grandparents filled the pews, programs rustling in eager hands. Sarah stood in the chapel's side room, straightening Amy's red velvet dress bow. "Remember what we talked about? Those mistakes we practiced?" Amy nodded solemnly, grace notes in disguise. She peeked through the door at the growing crowd. "Miss Sarah? Is that empty seat in the back for your daddy?" Sarah's heart skipped. That last pew, her father's silent vigil for a decade. Would tonight be different? The afternoon train from Arizona had arrived on schedule, but no one had seen Thomas Mitchell in town. Mrs. Henderson appeared, carrying an armful of poinsettias. "Sarah, dear, it's time. The children are ready." One by one, Sarah's students took their turns at the Steinway. Little Tommy played "Away in a Manger," his small fingers finding each note with careful precision. Katie's "What Child Is This?" floated through the sanctuary like a prayer. Each performance carried its own story of perseverance, of growth, of hope. Between pieces, Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations. Remember when Thomas Mitchell used to play at midnight service? Elizabeth would be so proud. Did you hear? He's back in town? Amy's turn came. As she began Silent Night, Sarah noticed movement at the back of the church. A tall figure slipped into that familiar last pew, silver hair catching the candlelight. Her father. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, her heart pounding. More students performed, each Christmas carol adding another layer to the evening's magic. The Mitchell bell gleamed on the great tree, sending sparkles of light across the sanctuary with every movement of air. Finally, it was time for Sarah's piece. She approached the piano, adjusting the bench just as her father had taught her. The sanctuary fell silent, waiting. Tonight's final piece, she spoke softly into the quiet, is dedicated to my mother, Elizabeth Mitchell, who never stopped believing in the power of forgiveness. And, she paused, gathering courage, to my father Thomas, who taught me that it's never too late to come home. As her fingers found the opening notes of O Holy Night, Sarah felt rather than saw her father lean forward in his pew. The familiar melody filled the sanctuary, each note carrying years of longing, of hope, of grace. Fall on your knees, oh hear the angel voices. Halfway through the piece, something extraordinary happened. The great church bell, silent for 10 years, began to toll softly, its deep resonance harmonizing perfectly with the piano. Heads turned toward the bell tower in amazement. Sarah played on, tears blurring her vision. She knew who must have climbed the tower before the recital, who had finally used that repair manual, who had waited 10 years to ring that bell again. O night divine. As the final notes faded into the candlelit silence, the bell gave one last gentle toll. Then Sarah heard footsteps. Steady, familiar footsteps. Walking up the center aisle. She turned to find her father standing there, tears streaming down his face. The years had silver-streaked his hair, lined his face, but his eyes were the same ones that had patiently taught her scales, had watched her grow from the shadows, had never stopped loving her even when shame kept him away. Sarah, he whispered, voice breaking. That was beautiful. The sanctuary held its breath. A decade of silence hung between father and daughter as surely as the last echo of the bell's toll. Then little Amy broke the spell, running forward to thrust a candy cane at Thomas. Are you Miss Sarah's daddy? She taught me about grace notes too. Something in Sarah's heart shifted, like ice breaking up on a spring river. Because there, in Amy's innocent gesture, she saw what her mother had known all along, that love was stronger than mistakes, that grace could bridge any distance, that Christmas miracles still happened in Pine Grove, Maine. The Mitchell bell chimed softly from the tree, stirred by the winter draft, as father and daughter faced each other in the warm glow of candlelight and forgiveness. The audience had long since departed, leaving the sanctuary lit only by candles and the twinkling lights of the great tree. Sarah and Thomas sat in the front pew, the Mitchell bell hanging above them, its gentle presence a witness to this moment 10 years in the making. I watched you grow up from that back pew, Thomas began, his voice rough with emotion. Every Christmas recital, every special service, I'd slip in after the lights dimmed and leave before they came up. He twisted his hands in his lap, weathered by years of truck driving across the country. Your mother knew. She'd leave little signs, a bulletin with my name, a cookie from your Christmas baking. Sarah touched the piano keys lightly, not playing, just feeling their familiar smoothness. Why didn't you ever come forward? All those years. Shame, he answered simply. At first it was the investment scheme. I'd convinced half the town to invest their savings, their children's college funds. When it all collapsed, he drew a shaky breath. But then, as years passed, the shame of leaving became even greater than the shame that drove me away. A candle flickered nearby, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Through the stained glass windows, snow continued to fall, muffling the world outside this moment of truth. Mom wrote you letters, Sarah said. Every Christmas. I found them in the attic. Thomas nodded, tears gleaming in the candlelight. She sent the last one, just before. He pulled an envelope from his pocket, worn soft from repeated reading. She told me about the cancer, about her wishes for you, about forgiveness. Sarah remembered the recipe book in the church kitchen, her mother's notes in the margins, all those years of quiet hope, of patient waiting. She never gave up on you. No, Thomas agreed softly. Elizabeth always saw the best in people, even when we couldn't see it in ourselves. He looked up at the Mitchell bell. Remember when I taught you about overtones, how a single note contains many sounds? Sarah nodded, memory washing over her. Sunday afternoons at the piano, her father explaining the physics of music, the mathematics of harmony. These 10 years have been like that, he continued. One long note of regret, but containing so many other tones. Love, hope, pride in who you've become. Every time I heard you play, every student you taught, the overtones of grace kept building. The candles cast their warm glow on the nativity scene, still set up from the children's earlier arrangements. The restored Joseph figure stood proud among the shepherds, its ancient breaks visible only to those who knew where to look. I have something to show you, Thomas said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a stack of programs, every Christmas recital for the past decade. Each one bore Elizabeth's handwriting. He's here watching over you. Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched her mother's familiar script. She protected you, even from my anger. She protected both of us, Thomas corrected gently. She knew we'd need time, that some harmonies can't be rushed. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, once, twice, 3 times. Sarah looked at her father in surprise. I fixed it this afternoon, he admitted. Thought it was time Pine Grove heard its voice again. Time I found my own voice too. He paused, gathering courage. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. Sarah's hand found her father's, rough and warm and familiar despite the years. Mom's last note in her recipe book said, "Love rises in its own time." She squeezed his hand. Maybe forgiveness does too. The Mitchell bell tinkled softly above them, stirred by winter drafts or perhaps by something more divine. Its gentle music spoke of generations of faith, of breaks mended, of love that persisted through silence and separation. In the candlelight, father and daughter sat together, letting memories and hopes mingle like the shadows on the wall. Outside, Pine Grove slept beneath its blanket of snow, while inside First Baptist, the overtones of grace continued to build toward a harmony 10 years in the making. The warmth of the church kitchen provided a welcome refuge from the December night. Sarah moved around the familiar space, gathering ingredients for her mother's special hot chocolate recipe, the one reserved for moments that needed extra comfort. Thomas sat at the worn, wooden table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching his daughter with a mixture of wonder and hesitation. Your mother used to say that some conversations are better with chocolate, he said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Especially the hard ones. Sarah smiled despite herself, reaching for the old copper pot her mother had always used. She called this her healing pot, said it had made more peace than the town council. As she worked, muscle memory took over. The exact measure of Dutch cocoa, the pinch of cinnamon, the splash of vanilla that had to be poured from east to west, according to Elizabeth's playful insistence. The kitchen filled with the aroma of childhood Christmases, of moments before everything changed. The first Christmas after I left, Thomas began, his voice catching, I parked my truck down by Miller's Pond and watched the lights in our windows. You and your mother were baking. I could see you through the kitchen window. I wanted so badly to come home. Sarah stirred the chocolate slowly, watching it thicken. Why didn't you? Because I destroyed more than just our family's savings, he replied, pain evident in every word. Jack Turner lost his hardware store because of my recommendation. The Hendersons had to remortgage their farm. I couldn't face any of them. But you paid it all back, Sarah said, remembering the bank statements. Every penny. Thomas nodded, accepting the steaming mug she offered him. It took 10 years of long-haul routes, living in my truck, sending every spare dollar. Your mother knew. She kept track in that little red book she always carried. Sarah sat across from him, her own mug warming her hands. The recipe had turned out exactly right, just as her mother had taught her. She kept everything, you know. Every newspaper clipping, every program, every receipt for the anonymous donations to the music program. She was the true musician between us, Thomas said, taking a careful sip. She knew how to orchestrate healing, even from beyond. He paused, emotion overwhelming him. This tastes just like hers. Mom left notes about you in all her recipes, Sarah revealed. Add extra vanilla. Thomas loves the warmth. Stir until it shines, just like his eyes when he laughs. She watched the steam rise from their mugs. She never stopped loving you, never stopped believing you'd come home. The kitchen clock ticked softly, marking moments of shared silence. Through the window, they could see the church bell tower silhouetted against the snowy night sky. "I have something else to show you," Thomas said finally, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I kept track too. Every performance, every student recital, notes about your teaching style, how you handle shy students, how you've grown as a musician." His voice broke. "I watched you become an amazing woman, Sarah, even if it was from the shadows." Sarah opened the notebook with trembling hands. Page after page of careful observations, proud notations, a father's love documented in fading ink. December 18th, 2017, Sarah helped little Tommy overcome his stage fright today, just like Elizabeth would have done. The hot chocolate grew cooler as they sat there, sharing stories, filling in 10 years of gaps. Thomas told her about life on the road, about watching Pine Grove heal and grow from a distance. Sarah shared stories of her students, of community support, of her mother's quiet strength. Outside, snow continued to fall, and the church bell tolled midnight, its voice restored, like so many other things that night. The sound carried across Pine Grove, reaching past the town limits to where Miller's Pond reflected the winter stars. "Your mother's last note in her recipe book," Thomas said softly, "was about this hot chocolate. 'Some healing happens slowly,' she wrote. 'Stir with patience, serve with love, and trust in the warmth to do its work.'" Sarah reached across the table and took her father's hand. In the gentle kitchen light, surrounded by the aroma of chocolate and memories, father and daughter began the delicate work of rebuilding. One story, one sip, one moment at a time. Snow fell in gentle waves outside First Baptist as the clock approached midnight on Christmas Eve. Sarah and Thomas stood in the bell tower, their breath visible in the cold air, surrounded by decades of Pine Grove history. The ancient bell mechanism, newly restored by Thomas's careful work, waited silently for its moment of resurrection. "Every Christmas Eve," Thomas said, running his hand along the aged bronze, "this bell would ring out exactly at midnight. 12 peals to welcome Christmas Day." He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "The last time I rang it was the night I left." Sarah touched the bell's surface, feeling its cold smoothness beneath her fingers. "Why did you really stop it from ringing?" "Because bells don't just mark time," he answered softly. "They mark belonging. I didn't feel I had the right anymore." Below them, the sanctuary glowed with candlelight. The Christmas Eve service would begin soon, the first time in 10 years that father and daughter would attend together. Through the tower window, they could see families arriving, their forms dark shapes against the snow. "Your mother loved watching from up here," Thomas continued. "She said it was like seeing God's view of his family coming home." He drew a shaky breath. "The night I left, she found me here. I was going to ring the bell one last time, but I couldn't. It would have felt like a lie." Sarah remembered that night, lying awake, waiting for the familiar midnight tolling that never came. And now? Now? Thomas checked his watch. It's 11:57, time to decide if Pine Grove is ready to hear its voice again. The decision wasn't just about the bell. They both knew that. It was about restoration, about a father's right to reclaim his place, about a community's capacity for forgiveness. Suddenly, from below, a familiar voice called up. "Sarah? Mr. Mitchell?" It was Amy, still in her choir robe. "Mrs. Henderson says to tell you it's almost time for the service." Thomas looked at his daughter, question in his eyes. Sarah nodded, smiling through tears. Together, they began preparing the mechanism. 11:58. "I used to imagine this moment," Thomas admitted, adjusting the rope. "During long nights on the road, I'd hear this bell in my dreams." The sanctuary below filled with the soft murmur of congregation members finding their seats. The Mitchell bell on the Christmas tree caught the candlelight, sending prisms dancing across the walls. Midnight. Sarah and Thomas grasped the rope together, just as they had that last Christmas Eve a decade ago. The first peal rang out across Pine Grove, strong and clear in the snowy night. Second peal. Through the window, they saw people stopping on the street, looking up in wonder. Third peal. Someone in the sanctuary began to sing, "O Holy Night." Fourth peal. More voices joined in. Fifth peal. Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up. "The Mitchell tone is back in that bell." Sixth peal. Thomas's hands trembled on the rope. Seventh peal. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. Eighth peal. The snow fell harder as if heaven itself was celebrating. Ninth peal. The singing swelled below. 10th peal. Tears streamed freely down Thomas's face. 11th peal. "Welcome home, Dad," Sarah whispered. 12th peal. The final note hung in the air like a benediction. As the echo faded, Sarah pulled an envelope from her pocket, her mother's last Christmas card to Thomas. "Mom wrote this the day before she passed. She asked me to give it to you when the bell rang again." Thomas opened it with shaking hands. Elizabeth's familiar handwriting flowed across the page. "My dearest Thomas, when you read this, our bell will be ringing again, and our Sarah will have found her way to forgiveness. Love is patient, love is kind, and love always welcomes us home. Merry Christmas, my love, Elizabeth." Below, the Christmas Eve service began. Father and daughter descended the tower steps hand in hand, ready to take their places in the family pew. Not the back row this time, but right up front, where Elizabeth had always saved space, believing in this moment. The Mitchell bell on the tree tinkled softly as they passed, and somewhere, they both knew, Elizabeth was smiling. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear over Pine Grove, the rising sun casting pink and gold across fresh snow. Inside First Baptist's Fellowship Hall, Sarah and Thomas worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing the traditional Christmas breakfast that Elizabeth had started years ago for families who had nowhere else to go on Christmas morning. "Your mother always insisted on real maple syrup," Thomas said, flipping waffles on the old iron that had been Elizabeth's pride. Said artificial sweetness had no place in true hospitality. Sarah smiled, whisking eggs exactly as her mother had taught her. "She kept your waffle recipe taped inside the cabinet door all these years. Thomas's Christmas morning love," she called it. The kitchen filled with familiar aromas, coffee brewing, bacon sizzling, and the sweet scent of vanilla and cinnamon that marked the Mitchell family waffles. Through the serving window, they could see volunteers setting up tables, each one decorated with Elizabeth's hand-crocheted Christmas runners that she'd made during her illness. "I have something for you," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package. "I bought it that last Christmas. Never got the chance to give it to you." Sarah unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a delicate silver charm bracelet, its first charm a tiny piano. "Dad, I've added a charm every year," he explained softly, "even though I couldn't give it to you." One by one he pointed them out. A bell for her first recital as a teacher, a book for her college graduation, a heart for each year she'd carried on her mother's traditions of kindness. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a knock at the kitchen door. Mrs. Henderson peeked in, smiling at the scene before her. "The first families are arriving. And Sarah, honey, your students are here to help serve." The fellowship hall quickly filled with people, not just those in need of a meal, but families from all over Pine Grove coming together as they had every Christmas morning under Elizabeth's gentle influence. Amy and the other piano students moved between tables, proudly wearing Santa hats and carrying plates of waffles. Thomas stood at the waffle iron, teaching Tommy the secret to perfect timing, just as he'd once taught Sarah. The boy listened with rapt attention, his own father's empty chair at home momentarily forgotten in the warmth of this Christmas morning. "Mr. Mitchell," Amy called out, rushing up with an empty plate. "Everyone says these taste just like the ones Mrs. Mitchell used to make." "That's because love is the secret ingredient," Sarah answered for her father, watching his eyes grow misty. "Mom always said that." As the morning progressed, more stories emerged. Mrs. Peterson shared how Elizabeth had started this breakfast tradition after finding a family sleeping in their car one Christmas morning. Mr. Turner, whose hardware store had recovered thanks to Thomas's anonymous repayments, spoke about second chances and community strength. Near the end of the morning, Sarah stood to make an announcement. "Mom always said that music and food were God's ways of bringing people together," she began, her father's hand warm on her shoulder. "So today, we'd like to share our plans for the Elizabeth Mitchell School of Music." She revealed their vision, using the restored church annex, offering lessons to any child who wanted to learn, regardless of ability to pay. Thomas would teach theory and piano mechanics, while Sarah would continue with piano instruction. And, Thomas added, his voice strong with purpose. Every student will learn about grace notes, those beautiful mistakes that make music human and real. The fellowship hall erupted in applause. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears with her Christmas napkin, and Amy hugged her music folder with excitement. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway, watching their community, their family, sharing this Christmas morning. Through the windows, they could see the church bell tower standing proud against the winter sky, its voice restored, its message of hope ringing clear in their hearts. "Your mother's last Christmas card to me," Thomas said softly, ended with words I'll never forget. "Love doesn't keep count of wrongs or time. It simply waits, hopes, and celebrates when the lost come home." Sarah fingered the charm bracelet on her wrist, 10 years of love made tangible in silver. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake a promise of fresh beginnings. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a gentle rhythm of healing and renewal. Sarah and Thomas spent each evening in the church annex, transforming the space into what would become the Elizabeth Mitchell School of Music. Each room held memories. The parlor, where Elizabeth had taught her first students, the small office where she'd kept meticulous records of every child's progress. "Your mother wrote about this," Thomas said one evening, carefully placing a framed photo of Elizabeth on what would be the school's front desk. In her last letter, she said she dreamed of music filling these rooms again. The renovation moved forward with the speed that only a small town's dedication can achieve. Mr. Turner, whose hardware store had flourished again after Thomas's anonymous repayments, donated all the paint. The Henderson boys installed new lighting, their father beaming with pride as he supervised. Every contribution felt like a stitch, mending the fabric of community that had been torn a decade ago. One particularly cold evening, as Sarah and Thomas sorted through boxes of old sheet music, they found Elizabeth's teaching journal. Its pages held more than lesson plans. They contained her vision for what music could mean to a small town like Pine Grove. Mom never gave up on any of it, Sarah realized, reading through the careful notes. The school, your return, the healing of our town, she saw it all as one grand symphony. The bell tower, visible through the annex windows, stood proud against the winter sky. Its voice, silent for so long, now rang out each evening at sunset. A new tradition that Thomas had started, marking not just the close of day, but the constant possibility of renewal. As New Year's Eve approached, word spread through Pine Grove about a special concert planned for the school's opening. Sarah's students, past and present, would perform alongside Thomas, who would return to the piano publicly for the first time since his departure. The morning of the concert arrived with fresh snow and clear skies. Sarah found her father in the sanctuary early, sitting at the Steinway, his fingers hovering over the keys. "I used to imagine this," he said softly as she sat beside him. "During those years on the road, I'd dream of playing here again, of being worthy of it." Sarah placed her hands next to his on the keys. Together they began to play "O Holy Night," their duet filling the sanctuary with memories and hope. As they played, morning light streamed through the stained glass, painting the piano in colors of grace. The concert that evening became more than just a performance. It transformed into a celebration of restoration. The sanctuary overflowed with townspeople, each carrying their own story of loss and redemption. Amy opened the program with a confident rendition of Silent Night, her small fingers sure on the keys, her face beaming with pride. One by one, students shared their gifts, each performance a testament to the power of perseverance and love. Mr. Turner's granddaughter played a piece Elizabeth had taught her years ago. Tommy, who still waited for his own father's return, performed with Thomas beside him, 4 hands on the keys, creating beauty from brokenness. Before the final piece, Sarah stood to address the crowd. "Mom used to say that music is God's way of giving us a second chance at every missed note." She looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "Tonight, we're not just opening a school, we're celebrating all the second chances that make life beautiful." Thomas joined her at the piano for the finale, their duet of Amazing Grace bringing tears to every eye in the sanctuary. As they played, the great bell began to toll, its deep voice joining the piano in perfect harmony. Through the windows, they could see more snow beginning to fall, each flake a promise of fresh beginnings. After the applause faded and the sanctuary slowly emptied, Sarah and Thomas remained at the piano. The Mitchell bell on the Christmas tree tinkled softly in the evening draught, its gentle voice a reminder of all that had been restored. "I found something else in Mom's teaching journal," Sarah said, pulling out a folded paper. "It's dated the day before she passed." Thomas took it with trembling hands and read aloud. "My dearest ones, music has taught me that no silence is permanent, no break irreparable, no distance too far for love to cross. Thomas, your shame was always smaller than God's grace. Sarah, your hurt was always temporary, your capacity for forgiveness always stronger. Together, you'll make music that will heal not just yourselves but our whole community. Love always, Elizabeth." The next morning dawned bright and clear, the new year stretching out before them full of possibility. The Elizabeth Mitchell School of Music opened its doors, welcoming its first students, some paying with dollars, others with dedication, all received with the same gentle grace that Elizabeth had shown throughout her life. The Mitchell bell, now hanging proudly in the school's entryway, chimed softly as each student entered. Its voice, once silenced by shame and separation, now rang out with the clear tone of forgiveness and hope. In its melody, those who listened closely could hear the echoes of a mother's faith, a father's redemption, and a daughter's healing heart. And so, in a small Maine town called Pine Grove, where winters are long and memories run deep, a new chapter began. Not just for Sarah and Thomas, but for every person who believed in the power of second chances, in the healing touch of music, and in the timeless truth that love, like the sweetest carol, never really ends. Thank you for joining me for the gift of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share in the comments your own experiences with forgiveness and healing during the Christmas season. What family traditions keep your loved ones close? Do you have a special Christmas memory of reconciliation? Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us of life's most precious gifts. Remember, like the gentle toll of a Christmas bell, it's never too late for love to find its way home.